Every relationship is built on what two people tell each other about themselves, their history, their family, their work, their losses, the story of who they are. Wilfred Somerset listened carefully to every word she told him. He asked good questions. He remembered the details. He felt, over 2 years, that he knew Veronica Santos deeply. Her education, her past, her heartbreaks, her ambitions. Every single thing she told him was a lie. Not small lies, not exaggerations or omissions. A complete and total fiction, built from nothing, sustained for 2 years, and worth, to her, $440,000. To him, it cost something that money can't measure. There was a photograph she showed me once, on her phone. She scrolled to it deliberately, the way you do when you've decided to share something personal, tilted the screen toward me and said, "This is my father. This was taken just before he died." The man in the photograph was older, wearing a barong Tagalog, standing in front of what looked like a church. He had a gentle face. She said his name was Eduardo. She said he had been a civil engineer who had worked on infrastructure projects in the provinces. She said he had died of a heart attack 4 years earlier, and that it had left a specific kind of hole in her life that she had never fully recovered from. I looked at the photograph for a long time. I said, "He looks like someone who was proud of you." She said, "He was. He always told me my education was the best thing he ever gave me." I believed it. I believed the photograph, the name, the barong Tagalog, the civil engineer, the infrastructure projects, the heart attack, the whole. 2 years later, I found out through a background investigation that her father's name was not Eduardo, that he was not a civil engineer, that he had not died of a heart attack 4 years earlier, that he was, as far as the investigator could establish, alive and working as a security guard in a building in Taguig. The photograph was real. The man in it was real. The story attached to him was entirely fabricated. That is the one I keep coming back to. Not the money, not the education she invented, or the professional history she constructed, or the previous relationships she described in such specific detail that I felt I knew the men she had been with before me. Not any of those. The photograph, the gentle face, the way she tilted the screen toward me with the deliberate intimacy of sharing something true. I need to go back to the beginning, because what happened to me over 2 years cannot be understood except from the beginning. My name is Wilfred Somerset. I am 71 years old, from Boston, and I spent 36 years building and operating a mid-size commercial printing company that I started in my 30s with a small loan and a large amount of stubbornness, and sold in 2020 for enough to be comfortable for the remainder of my life. I have 2 ex-wives, Patricia, from a marriage that lasted 11 years and ended when I was 43, and Donna, from a marriage that lasted 16 years and ended when I was 64. Both divorces were honest, in the sense that the reasons for them were real and acknowledged. Both left me with a clearer understanding of my own limitations as a partner. I work too hard. I am emotionally present in intermittent rather than sustained ways, and I have a habit of investing more in the picture of a relationship than in the daily maintenance of it. I know these things about myself. I have known them for years. Knowing them has not always made them easier to correct. I have a son from my first marriage, Patrick, 42, who lives in Brookline and runs a software company. We are close in the functional, scheduled way that fathers and sons sometimes become close when the early years were inconsistent. Weekly calls, annual trips, a relationship that is real, but that required deliberate construction by both of us. My daughter Leanne, 38, is from my second marriage and lives in Seattle. She is closer to her mother, but has never been cold to me, which I appreciate because I would understand if she were. After the sale of the company, I retired into a space that was financially comfortable and personally sparse. I had worked 6 days a week for 36 years. The absence of that structure was not peaceful. It was disorienting, a silence where noise had been for so long that the quiet felt like something was wrong. I traveled. I played golf badly. I read more than I had in decades. I spent time with Patrick's kids, my grandchildren, which was the best of those years. I went to the Philippines on my second trip abroad in retirement. The first had been Portugal, which I liked, and which was not what I needed, because what I needed, though I would not have said so at the time, was somewhere completely unlike anywhere I had been. Manila was completely unlike anywhere I had been. I went for 3 weeks and stayed for 5, and came home with the beginning of something I would not have expected, the feeling that I wanted to go back. I met Veronica Santos at a private dining event in Makati, the kind of expat social gathering that Manila's international community produces constantly, where the guest list is a mix of foreign residents, local professionals, and visiting business people, and where the conversations are in English and the food is excellent. She was introduced to me by the host as a professional in the hospitality industry. She described herself that way, with a specific ease that suggested the description was a familiar shorthand for something more detailed. She said she consulted for hotel groups on food and beverage positioning. She was 37. She was composed and well-spoken, and had the particular quality that I have always found compelling, and which I will describe simply as, she seemed interested. Not in the performed way of someone working a room, in the way of someone who finds the person in front of them actually interesting, which is rarer than it sounds in social contexts, and which I respond to because I spent 36 years in rooms where most people were interested in the transaction rather than the person. We talked for 2 hours at that dinner. She told me about her work, a consulting project she was completing for a boutique hotel chain that wanted to reposition its dining offering. She talked about the specifics with enough precision to sound real: menu engineering, supplier relationships, price point psychology. She asked about my printing company, with the kind of follow-up questions that indicate genuine attention rather than polite engagement. She had opinions. She expressed them without deference. At the end of the evening, she gave me her card and said, "If you're back in Manila, let me know. The food scene here is worth knowing properly, and I can show it to you better than a hotel concierge can." I was back in Manila 3 months later, and I called her. What followed over the next year was what I would describe, without qualification, as the most engaging personal relationship I had experienced since before my second marriage. She was funny in a dry, precise way. She read widely and had opinions about what she read. She traveled within the Philippines for her consulting work and would send me photographs and descriptions of the places she visited: a resort in Palawan, a heritage property in Vigan, a small farm-to-table operation in Benguet, with the detailed, curious observations of someone who paid genuine attention to where they were. She talked about her past with the unself-conscious ease of someone who has processed their history and is comfortable with it. Her father Eduardo, the civil engineer. Her mother Regina, who had passed away from cancer when Veronica was 22. A brother named Rommel who lived in Canada. An education at the University of the Philippines, where she had studied business administration and graduated with honors. 2 previous significant relationships, the first with a Filipino architect who she had lived with for 3 years before the relationship ended over irreconcilable differences about children, and the second with a British consultant who she had met through work and who she described as someone she had loved genuinely but who had ultimately wanted a life she was not ready for. These were not vague outlines. They were detailed, specific, internally consistent accounts. She talked about her father's projects with the kind of incidental technical detail that suggests real memory: a bridge in Leyte, a drainage system in Pampanga, the particular frustration of provincial government procurement. She talked about her mother's illness with a grief that had the texture of something genuinely processed rather than performed. She described the relationship with the British consultant in enough detail that I felt I knew his habits and his limitations. Over months of conversation, I accumulated a portrait of a person, a full, rich, internally consistent portrait, and I knew it. I felt the knowledge of it as something solid and substantial, the way you know a city when you've walked its streets rather than driven through it. None of it was real, but I did not know that for a very long time. The financial dimension of our relationship did not begin with a request. That matters. It began with a situation that I observed and chose to address. She mentioned, in passing, during a conversation about a consulting project that had been delayed, that the delay was creating a cash flow gap, that she had expenses and a project payment that was 30 days late in arriving. She was not asking me, she was describing her week. I offered to help. She resisted. Genuinely, it seemed, she said she didn't want that dynamic between us, that financial complications were bad for relationships, that she had managed her own affairs for 15 years and would manage this. I told her I understood all of that, and that the offer stood if she changed her mind. She did not change her mind that week. 2 weeks later, she mentioned that the project payment had still not arrived, and that she was going to have to move some of her savings to cover the gap, which she didn't love. I said again, "Let me." She said again, "I don't want to do that." I said, "It's not charity, it's what people do when they care about each other, and you can pay it back when the payment comes." She took the money, $11,000. The payment arrived, she told me, 3 weeks later. She did not repay the $11,000. I did not ask for it. I noticed this in the way you notice something when you've decided not to make an issue of it. Not with suspicion, just with a small filing away. Over the following 22 months, the pattern expanded. Not dramatically, not in a way that would have been legible as a pattern if you were looking at it from inside the warmth of what I believed we had. The consulting work was intermittent. Some months it paid well, some months the clients delayed or the projects stalled. She had recurring personal expenses that were real in the specific ways she described them. Rent on her apartment, a car payment, quarterly tax liabilities, a payment she made each month to support her mother. And here is where the fabrications were most complete. Because her mother was dead, she had told me, but the money she described as supporting a living mother was going somewhere I would never verify. I gave her money 41 times over 22 months. I know this because I counted them in the spreadsheet I built after the investigation concluded. Every transfer, every amount, every stated reason. The amounts ranged from $4,000 to $38,000. The total, when I added every line, was $440,000. 41 transfers, 2 years, one person who did not exist. The person I gave that money to, the educated, bereaved, professionally accomplished, emotionally complex woman I thought I was in a relationship with, was a construction. Every component of her that I had believed was real had been selected and assembled for the specific purpose of being believable to someone like me. The first disruption came, not from any external source, but from a small internal inconsistency that my mind would not let go. She had mentioned, early in our relationship, that she had graduated from the University of the Philippines in 2009. She had said she was born in 1986 and had started her business administration program at 19. The numbers worked. At some later point, I cannot remember now what triggered the recollection. I remembered that she had also mentioned, in a separate conversation months later, that her mother had died when she was 22, in what she described as her final year of school. If she had started at 19 and graduated in 2009, her final year would have been 2008 or 2009. If she was born in 1986 and her mother died when she was 22, that would be 2008. The timing fit. There was nothing wrong with the timeline, but something about revisiting it made me aware that I had been, without realizing it, tracking these details, checking them without consciously checking, and that the consciousness of that tracking was itself a signal worth paying attention to. I mentioned it to my friend Roy Whitfield, who lives in Manila and had become my primary social connection in the Philippines over the 2 years of my involvement with Veronica. Roy was a retired hotel executive from Cincinnati who had been in Manila for 8 years, and who I trusted as someone with both personal warmth and a pragmatic clarity about life in the Philippines. I did not frame it as suspicion. I framed it as a question. Did he know anyone who did background verification? Professionally, discreetly, the kind of thing that a business person might use for due diligence purposes. Roy knew someone. He connected me with an investigator named Mr. Efren de la Cruz, who ran a small firm in Quezon City that specialized in background research for corporate clients and occasionally for private individuals. I instructed Mr. Dela Cruz to verify what I believed I knew about Veronica Santos, not to investigate her for wrongdoing. I want to be precise about that, because my framing at the time was still protective of her. I framed it as, I want to confirm what she's told me, because I'm considering deepening this relationship significantly, and I want to be sure I know who I'm dealing with. Mr. Dela Cruz's report took 21 days. I received it on a Tuesday morning in my hotel room in Makati. I had specifically come to Manila for that week, without telling Veronica why I was there. I had told her I had business matters to handle and would see her on Thursday. I read the report in full before I moved from the chair I was sitting in. The University of the Philippines had no record of a Veronica Santos graduating in the Business Administration program in 2009, nor in any adjacent year. The name did not appear in their graduation records. Her professional background, the hospitality consulting work, the hotel group clients, could not be verified against any corporate record. The companies she had named either had no record of engaging her or, in 2 cases, did not exist. The British consultant she had described as a former partner was, as best as Mr. Dela Cruz could determine, a composite fiction. The specific person she had described could not be identified against the details she had provided. Her brother Rommel in Canada could not be located through any of the identification details she had mentioned. Her mother Regina, whom she had told me died of cancer when Veronica was 22, appeared to be alive according to national identity records, living in a province south of Manila. Her father, whose photograph she had shown me with the story of the Barong Tagalog and the civil engineering career and the heart attack, was named not Eduardo, but something else entirely, and was alive and working in Taguig. I read all of this. I read it in the chair in my hotel room on a Tuesday morning, and I did not move for a long time. Then I called Patrick. Patrick answered on the second ring. I told him I needed to talk about something important. He shifted immediately into the careful, attentive mode he uses when he knows something has happened. I told him what I had found. I read him portions of the report. I told him the $440,000 figure. He was quiet for a period that felt long. Then he said, "Dad, are you all right?" "I don't know yet," I said. "Physically, you're safe?" "Yes, I'm in my hotel room." "Okay," he said. "Okay, I want to ask you something, and I need you to hear it without getting defensive." "Go ahead," I said. "Did you have any sense that something was off? At any point?" I sat with that question. I wanted to say no. I wanted to be able to say that I had been completely blind, that there had been no signal, that I could not possibly have known. It would have been easier to say that. "There were small things," I said, "details that I checked internally and found consistent enough to not pursue. I was checking. I just wasn't checking the right things or going far enough with the checking." "Okay," he said. "That's honest. What do you need right now?" What I needed right now was to figure out what to do with a Tuesday and a Thursday, and a woman who would be expecting me at a restaurant she had chosen, who did not yet know that I knew. I did not cancel Thursday. I want to be honest about why. It was not bravery or strategic clarity. It was the specific human need, when you have been living inside a story for 2 years, to see the person who told you the story one more time, now that you know it was a story. To look at the face, to see what it looks like when you're not seeing it through the filter of everything you believed. She was already at the restaurant when I arrived. She looked exactly as she always looked, composed, warm, dressed with the casual professionalism I had come to associate with her. She stood when I came to the table and embraced me the way she always did. Her perfume was the same. Her voice when she said my name was the same. I sat down. We ordered. We talked about ordinary things for perhaps 20 minutes. Her week, a project she said she was completing, a place she had visited on the weekend. I listened. I watched her construct the week for me in the language she had always used, the specific, warm, plausible language of a real life. Then I set the report on the table. Not the whole report. I had brought 3 pages. The pages about her educational record, her professional history, and her father. She looked at the pages. She did not reach for them immediately. She looked at them for a moment, and then she looked at me, and I saw something in her face that I had never seen before. Not the composed, warm face I knew. Something underneath it, older and more tired. The face of someone who has been holding a position under sustained pressure and can feel it giving way. "Where did this come from?" she said. "I had you investigated," I said. "I want to know what's true." She looked at the pages again. She picked up the one about her educational record and read it in a way that looked like someone confirming what they already know, rather than discovering something new. "I went to a different school," she said. "Not up. I studied at a private college. I didn't think you'd know it." "Why did you say UP?" I said. A pause. "Because you would have thought more of it." "And your father?" I said. "Eduardo, the civil engineer." She set the page down. She looked at the table. "My father and I are not close," she said. "What I told you was, I wanted a different kind of father. I wanted to tell you about the father I wished I had." "And your mother," I said. "You told me she was dead." She was very still. "Your mother is alive," I said. "She is living in a province south of Manila." The stillness continued. When she spoke, her voice was quiet. "My mother and I have not spoken in 6 years," she said. "To me, she is gone." I sat with that. It was the only answer she gave me that I believed might contain something real, buried under the version she had constructed. The silence of estrangement as a kind of death. But even if it was real, it did not explain the fabrication. It did not explain Eduardo and the Barong Tagalog and the infrastructure projects and the gentle face she had shown me on her phone with the deliberate intimacy of sharing something true. "The $440,000, I said. "The consulting delays, the cash flow gaps, the support I gave, was any of it real? Was any of the work real?" She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I do work in hospitality. Not consulting. I work in service. Front of house, mainly. The work is real. The framing of it was not." "And the money you said was going to your mother," I said. "Every month." She did not answer. I had my answer. I left the restaurant. Not in a storm. I did not raise my voice. I did not make a scene. I simply picked up the pages, put them back in my folder, and said I needed to go. She said my name as I stood. I did not respond to it. I walked out into the Manila street and stood on the pavement for a moment, with the noise of the city around me, and I felt something that I would describe not as devastation, but as the particular hollow clarity of a man who has finally seen something clearly that he had been choosing not to see for 2 years. I engaged Attorney Rosa Magalang, a Manila attorney who specialized in fraud cases involving foreign nationals, at Roy's recommendation. She reviewed the background report, the financial transaction records, and my account of the relationship. She was direct. She said the elements of fraud were present, the misrepresentation, the financial harm, but that prosecution in the Philippine courts was a process with uncertain timelines and outcomes, and that the practical question of financial recovery was, as it always is in these cases, complicated by the dispersal of funds over a long period through what appeared to be ordinary living expenses rather than a single traceable diversion. "She spent it," Attorney Magalang said, "on her life, on whatever she told you it was for. Money spent is harder to recover than money moved." "I understand," I said. "Do you want me to file the complaint?" I said yes. Not from any expectation of recovery. I had processed enough by then to have realistic expectations. But because the alternative was to have no record that it happened, no formal accounting of what had been done, and I could not accept that. Patrick flew out. He did not ask my permission, and I did not ask him not to. He arrived on a Friday, and we spent a weekend in Manila, doing what I needed to do, which was mostly walking and talking, and being in each other's company, without the weight of the story requiring active management. He asked me, on the last morning, what I most wanted to understand that I still didn't. I want to understand when she decided, I said. Whether she walked into that dinner 2 years ago, knowing exactly what she was going to do, or whether it evolved. Whether she made a choice to build a false identity for me at the beginning, or whether the identity just grew because it was working and it got harder to stop. Does it change anything? He said. Not practically, I said. It would just change how I feel about myself. Because? Because if she decided at the beginning, the decision was hers and I was just the available target. But if it evolved, if she started something and then found it was too late to stop, then at some point there was a version of me she could have told the truth to, and she chose not to. And I might have done something in that period that made it easier for her to choose not to. Patrick was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Dad, you're looking for a way to own some of it. Maybe, I said. You don't have to, he said. I know, I said. But the thing is, I should have checked earlier. Not the background report. That was late. Earlier than that, I mean. I should have pushed on the inconsistencies I was tracking internally. I was doing the checking half-heartedly because I didn't want the answer. He nodded slowly. That I believe, he said. I have been back in Boston since September. The house in Brookline is the same. The mornings are cold now, and I have been walking more than I used to, for the same reason people walk when they have something to process. It keeps the body occupied and frees the mind to work on what it needs to work on. Leanne called from Seattle 2 weeks after I got back. Patrick had told her the broad outlines. She was careful with me in the way that daughters are careful with fathers when they are trying not to say the thing they actually think, which in this case I believe was something like, why did you give someone $440,000 without knowing who she was? I appreciated the care. I also answered the unasked version of the question directly. I knew who she presented herself as, I said. I didn't know who she actually was. The difference is that I should have verified one against the other, and I didn't, because I didn't want to disturb what I had. She was quiet. Then she said, What did you have, though? If it was all made up. I had thought about this. I had 2 years of real conversation, I said. Real engagement, real laughter, real meals. The things we did together were real. My experience of them was real. The person doing them with me she was not who she said she was, but she was someone. I just don't know who. Leanne said, That's actually kind of sad, for her too. I thought about that. It is kind of sad for her too. A person who constructs a complete alternative history and inhabits it for 2 years, across dozens of conversations and hundreds of meals and 41 financial transactions. That is not the life of someone who has what they need. I don't know what her life actually is. I don't know the real family she's estranged from, the real father working security in Taguig, the real story that led her to the fabricated one. I will probably never know. What I know is what I contributed to it, not the fabrication, that was hers entirely, but the conditions that allowed it to run for 2 years, the internal tracking I did and didn't follow through on, the questions I half asked and half answered, the checking I did inside the framework she had built rather than from outside it, the specific and fundamental desire to have what I thought I had be real, which is the most common and most costly thing a lonely person can want. I am not going to say I was simply deceived by a skilled person and bear no responsibility. I was deceived by a skilled person. I also declined, repeatedly and deliberately, to look too hard at the things that could have undeceived me earlier and at lower cost. Roy called last week from Manila. He apologized again for the investigator referral being later rather than earlier, and I told him again that it was not his to apologize for. He asked if I would come back to Manila. I told him I didn't know yet. The city itself is not what I'm processing. The city is fine. What I'm processing is the 2 years, the weight of them, the real things inside them, and the false ones. The question of how to hold memory that is real and vivid and warm when the person at the center of it was presenting a fiction. Patrick said something before he flew back from Manila that I have been sitting with. He said, Dad, you're good at knowing things from the outside. You built a company on reading markets and people. You just have trouble applying it to yourself. That's not a permanent condition. I think he's right. It is not a permanent condition. But it is a persistent one, and at 71 years old I am aware that the time available to correct persistent conditions is shorter than it once was. Attorney Magalang's complaint is moving through the Philippine system. I am not expecting much from it. What I am expecting, what I am, slowly and with effort, working toward, is a version of my own later years that is built on things I can verify, not a contracted, suspicious, defended life, but a careful one. A life in which I apply to my own choices something approaching the same scrutiny I applied to 36 years of business decisions. The photograph on her phone, the man in the barong Tagalog, the gentle face. I do not know who he is to her. I do not know what the real story is, between a daughter and a father who is alive in Taguig, while she told the world he died 4 years ago. That is her story, not mine, and it is not one I will ever know. But I know what she said when I looked at that photograph. She said, "He always told me my education was the best thing he ever gave me." And I believed it. I believed it because I wanted it to be the kind of story that is true. That is the last lesson, and it is the oldest one, and I am still learning it. Wanting something to be true is not the same as it being true, and the gap between those two things is where everything can be lost. I know that now. I am working on knowing it in a way that holds,